Hey guys, so the top criticism of the reliability of the New Testament today in scholarly circles is called the legendary hypothesis. So, whatever hypothesis you think makes a lot of sense, no one who knows anything, even atheist scholars who know anything, they don't believe it, which is kind of a weird thing. The only real argument is the legendary hypothesis. That's where the debate is. And the legendary hypothesis is that says that the Gospels were slowly changed over time. Now, all of the evidence indicates that if they were slowly changed, they were in existence by by 100 years after the time of Jesus. There were no more changing. And in fact, you've got things like Corinthians being written in 55 A.D. and sort of that stuff. And so, if it's a legend, it would have to be sort of a high-speed legend. This is the position that Bart Ehrman argues that. So the story of Jesus was slowly embellished over time. Now, if you believe in some other, if you think that there's no way we know anything about history or something like that, I've got another video how to prove Christianity true or is Christianity true. I made it recently, and you can check that out. It should be, go to my video list, and it'll be just a couple before this one. I think like two before this one, so you should find it fairly easily. And we'll go through. If you're into some like wacky theory, like some people will tell you, well, the Bible's translations of translations, so there's no way to know if any of that was what happened. Which is, that one's so bad, I don't think anyone. But anyway, I personally have just never taken the time to investigate this question of the high speed legend question. And a big point of the high speed legend question is that Mark was written first. And because by the time you get to John, John is so blatant with saying that Jesus is God and Jesus claimed to be God that there's not really much embellishment to the legend. I mean, once you're saying that Jesus is God, the legend's pretty embellished. Whereas Mark, the argument is that Jesus doesn't claim to be God in Mark, and that Jesus doesn't resurrect in Mark. You just have an empty tomb, and then the angels say that he resurrected, which is kind of retarded to say, well, there's no resurrection in Mark. There's no resurrection appearances in Mark, but it says that he resurrected. But the argument is that he didn't claim to be God. So maybe there was some Jesus was just raised from the tomb into heaven, and he wasn't God. And so the argument is that Jesus never claimed to be God, because if he had gone around saying he was God and then God raised him from the dead, that would prove that he really was, God. Now, this video is not for someone who's, if you're out there and you're just super skeptical of Christianity in general, go watch the other video, because this is for someone who's kind of more informed about this. So I'm not going to waste your time going through every little, thing. But I've got an audio book from a fella named Nabil Qureshi, and he actually goes through how, and just sort of debunks this high-speed legend hypothesis that Mark starts out with Jesus not God, and by the time you get to John, Jesus is God. And that's really not true. And the only reason that might be believable to us is because we're not Jewish, and we're not, especially not Jewish back then, and we're just not familiar with the Old Testament. And so what Mark does is he opens the book up, and it says, very first word, the beginning of the good news about Jesus the Messiah, the Son of God, as it is written in Isaiah the prophet. Which, Son of God, wouldn't necessarily, they would all see themselves as sons of God, as it is written in Isaiah the prophet. And this could be for Jehovah's Witnesses too, or someone today that claims that the Bible doesn't even say that Jesus is God. You could actually go here and debunk that. But anyway, he says, as it is written in Isaiah the prophet, and then he does this thing that demonstrates that he is assuming the reader is very familiar with the Old Testament, which is pretty much just a Jewish thing. Okay, so he says, I will send my messenger ahead of you who will prepare your way. A voice of one calling in the wilderness, prepare the way for the Lord, make straight paths for him. So he says, as it is written in Isaiah the prophet, and then he quotes from Malachi, and then he quotes from Isaiah. So what he's going to do here, he's going to take two passages and weave them together. And that's a very Jewish thing. First of all, for Jews, they would have prided themselves on being super familiar with the Old Testament and able to see the currents that run through it and look for parallel passages that are providing maybe different information but making the same point. That was something that Jews took very seriously. And so what he says is, as it says in Isaiah the prophet, and then he quotes Malachi. It's a very Jewish thing to see that those two passages are talking about the same thing. And from Mark's perspective, for the reader, he introduces the book with a very clear claim that Mark, right off the bat, Mark says Jesus is God with the intro to the book. If you are familiar with Judaism in the Old Testament, then it's right off the bat. So this is what Malachi says. If in other words, he quotes the passage briefly, but this is the actual verse from Malachi. I will send my messenger. Talking about John the Baptist, right? Because Mark's going to make that clear as he goes on in Mark. But I will send my messenger who will prepare the way before me. Then suddenly the Lord you are seeking will come to his temple. Whose temple is it? The messenger of the covenant whom you desire, says the Lord Almighty. Okay? And then we've got our Isaiah quotation. A voice of one calling in the wilderness, prepare the way for the Lord. Make straight in the desert a highway for our God. Every valley shall be raised up, every mountain and hill made low. The rugged ground shall become level, and all rugged places plain. And the glory of the Lord will be revealed, and all the people will see it together, for the mouth of the Lord has spoken. Now, Mark intros right off the bat, so we've debunked, right off the bat. But there's more here that's just interesting if you're interested in the Bible, because what Jesus does is what Mark's going to do is he's going to show how Jesus actually slowly revealed and hinted at his identity as God throughout his ministry, and Mark's going to do that. And Jesus says things as and people are like, I think he just proved he was God, or he just said he was God, or there's no way he's not God. But it was kind of vague and unclear, and he makes it more clear. He slowly but surely he eliminates it. So first, let's look at a few examples of some catch moments where people are like, wait, what? What did you just say? And the first one is just Mark 2. So what we got to do is go to Mark. I didn't have this one brought up. Mark chapter 2. And voila. Mark chapter 2. Now, what Jesus does, this is the famous healing pass where some people bring a paralytic to Jesus, and Jesus heals them, and it's the Sabbath. You're not supposed to do work on the Sabbath, and so Jesus is going to heal this man, and so when they bring the paralyzed man to Jesus, the first thing Jesus says is, "Son, your sins are forgiven." And the Pharisees are immediately they're sitting there saying, "Why does this fellow talk like that? He's blaspheming. Who can forgive sins but God alone?" Okay, and so immediately Jesus knew in his spirit that this was what they were thinking in their hearts, and he said to them, "Why are you thinking things? Which is easier, to say to this paralyzed man, 'Your sins are forgiven,' or to say, 'Get up and take your mat and walk'? But I want you to know that the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins." So he says to the man, he calls himself the Son of Man. We'll come back to that later. So he said to the man, "I tell you, get up, take your mat, and go home." He got up, took his mat, walked out in full view of them all. This amazed everyone, and they praised God, saying, "We have never seen anything like this." So it's he just kind of claimed to be God, but it wasn't super explicit. You know what I mean? But he kind of went there, Well, anyway, we've got a lot of kind of went there moments, right? And so then, later in the chapter, Jesus is going through the grain fields with his disciples, and his disciples begin to pick some of the heads of grain, and the Pharisees said to him, Why are they doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath? He answered, Have you never read what David did when he and his companions were hungry and need? In the days of Abiathar the high priest, he entered the house of God and ate the consecrated bread, which was only lawful for the priest to eat. And he gave some to his companions. So he gives so what Jesus does is gives a justification that in some situations it's okay to do that from the Old Testament, which wouldn't have anything to do with him claiming to be God. And then he just turns a switch and then he says this. Then he said to them, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath. So when he says he's Lord of the Sabbath is a day where you stop doing your earthly work to focus on God. It's a day for God. So to be Lord of the Sabbath, he kind of went there again. You know what I mean? So anyway, we got more such. It just gets more explicit as it goes, as Mark goes. So what Mark is saying is that Jesus just got more explicit with being God and claiming he was God. And then, so then if he's going his whole life claiming he's God, and one of the most sacred beliefs, the first commandment, is that you will have no other gods before me, and you will, then if he does perform a miracle and raise from the dead, then voila, he really was God. Okay, so that's key for the disciples and for everyone who, the witnesses to the resurrection, right? So then we get to Mark 6. Well, hold on. Before we talk about Mark 6, in Mark 6, Jesus walks on the water. Immediately the disciples got in the boat and went on ahead of him of Bethsaida. He dismissed the crowd. This is after Jesus had fed the 5,000, or fed a lot of people. All right, after leaving them, he went on a mountainside to pray. Jesus having prayer time. Later that night, the boat was in the middle of the lake and he was alone on land. He saw the disciples straining at the oars because the wind was against them. Shortly before dawn, he went out to them walking on the lake. He was about to pass them by, but when they saw him walking on the lake, they thought he was a ghost. They cried out because they saw him and were terrified. Immediately he spoke to them and said, Take courage, it is I. Don't be afraid. Then he climbed into the boat with them, and the wind died down. They were completely amazed, for they had not understood about the loaves. Their hearts were hardened. So also there was a calming of the storm, but it wasn't necessarily, just happened to die down at that moment. But he did walk on the water. This is another Old Testament reference. Job 9:8 is referring to God, and it says this: He alone stretches out the heavens and treads on the waves of the sea. But again, that's a poem. It's not super clear, but it is kind of go there, right? Well, then we have the calming of the storms. And we kind of calmed the storms there in Mark 6, but earlier in Mark 4, he totally calmed the storms. And then later, again in Mark 8, Jesus calmed the storm again. So they're on the water two times. Two times in the book of Mark where Jesus literally tells the storm to stop it. Alright, so this is what it says in Psalm 107. Some went out on the sea in ships. They were merchants on the mighty waters. They saw the works of the Lord, his wonderful deeds in the deep. The deep is another name for the ocean, right? He spoke and stirred up a tempest that lifted the waves. They mounted up to the heavens and went down to the depths. In their peril, their courage melted away. They reeled and staggered like drunkards. They were at their wits' end. Then they cried out to the Lord in their trouble, and he brought them out of their distress. He stilled the storm to a whisper. The waves of the sea were hushed. They were glad when it grew calm, and he guided them to their desired haven. Let them give thanks to the Lord for his unfailing love and his wonderful deeds for mankind, and exalt them in the assembly of the people, and praise him in the council of the elders. So it's making it a little more clear, and at the times that Jesus calms the storm, it says the disciples, they had a question they had among themselves afterwards. They were like, who is this? He speaks and even the wind and the seas obey him. They're like, who is this? Okay. Very Jewish stuff, right? Quoting the Psalms. Alright, now so then we get to the big reveal. All throughout the Gospels, well, this is what's called the Synoptic Gospels, which would be Mark and Luke and Matthew. Jesus refers to himself, I think, 80 times as the Son of Man. It's his preferred title that he gives himself. He calls himself the Son of Man, the Son of Man, the Son of Man, the Son of Man. You say, well, Jesus is claiming to be God. Why doesn't he just say, I'm God? Well, he kind of does it dramatically. Okay, so like he calls himself the Son of Man the whole time. I'm the Son of Man. I'm the Son of Man. I'm the Son of Man. And like by this point, like everyone's like got it. The Synoptic Gospels are called that because they don't just they're not just similar. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. They like will be on certain passages and certain stories of Jesus' life. They're like word for word the same, letter for letter the same. And so some people argue that there was a prior text called Q that they, got that from. But one thing that weaves throughout all of them is this Son of Man thing. But what everyone agrees on is that Mark was the first one. Okay, so this Son of Man thing is referred to the whole time. So it finally comes to a big head in Mark 14. Jesus is before the Jewish authorities, the Jewish smarty pants, the ultimate Old Testament scholars of ever, and because that's who they are, they are the rulers, the authority, even though they are ruled by Romans at the time. The Sanhedrin, right? The Jewish High Council. They took Jesus to the high priest and all the chief priests. The elders and the teachers of the law came together. Okay, well, there you go. All the chief priests, the elders, and the teachers of the law would be the Old Testament, came together. Peter followed him at a distance right into the courtyard of the high priest. There he sat with the guards and warmed himself at the fire. The chief priests and the whole Sanhedrin were looking for evidence against Jesus so that they could put him to death. But they did not find any. Okay, so they're trying to find dirt on him, and so it says they couldn't find anything he done wrong. That in itself, when you go digging, you get dirt on anyone. So this, if you've got all of the intellectuals of the society together and they can't find anything, that's something in and of itself. Who goes out and just says, "Yeah, I never did anything wrong ever," and actually gets away with it? Much less gets away with it in front of all the most learned people. I couldn't get away with that. If someone knew me and hung around me very much, I couldn't just like, "Yeah, I've never done anything wrong." That's an incredible claim in and of itself. But anyway, it says many falsely testified against him, but their statements didn't not agree. So they couldn't even get together good, proper lies. Like their conspiracies weren't effective because they didn't conspire together efficiently enough to make up the same lie about him. Then some stood up and gave this false testimony against him. We heard him say, "I will destroy this temple made with human hands, and in 3 days I will build another not made with hands." And then it says, "Yet even then their testimony did not agree." So finally the high priest is like had enough of it, and he stands up before them and he just asks Jesus, "Are you not going to answer? What is this testimony that these men are bringing against you?" But Jesus remained silent and gave no answer. He's waiting for the big moment. And this is what he says. Again the high priest asked him, "Are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One?" And this is the boom. And this is the big apex Act 3, crescendo epiphany moment. And what Jesus is going to do is he's before all of these people who've devoted their lives to memorizing the Old Testament and being super smarty pants and know everything about it, he is going to quote it. He's going to do this quote thing, but he's going to do the bring two passages together thing. So we're going to have to go read it, but they didn't have to go read it. They knew it way too well, right? "I am," said Jesus, "and you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One and coming on the clouds of heaven." What they knew exactly what he just said. The high priest tore his clothes. When you're tearing your clothes, that means you probably understand something about what's been said. Okay. "Why do we need any more witnesses?" he asked. "You have heard the blasphemy. What do you think?" They all condemned him as worthy of death. Then some began to spit at him. They blindfolded him, struck him with their fists, and said, they didn't open hand slap him, they punched him, and said, prophesy. And the guards took him and beat him. And we all know the story continues. But we need to not miss what had just happened. So first of all, Jesus quotes two passages and brings them together in like one sentence. When he says I am, that's the name of God. But, you know, of course a lot of people would use the word I am. Alright, so Jesus is quoting from Psalm 110, a very short portion of it. Because this is what it says. This is David says, the Lord says to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies a footstool for your feet. Literally, it's Yahweh, the literal name of God, says to Adonai, which would mean like a generic term, basically translates like Lord. So Yahweh, or God, says to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies a footstool for your feet. And this is the dead giveaway that Mark, the way he writes this and the way he records what happened, he assumes that the reader is very familiar with the Old Testament. And remember, they didn't have verses to look it up. They would, you know. The other part of the quotation where he talks about coming on the clouds, on the right hand, all that, is from Daniel 7. Now, there's references to the Son of Man in Ezekiel and I think in Hosea maybe, but they are not a person in authority. It's sort of like, I think Ezekiel refers to himself as a son of man, but it's more like a guy who's treated really bad. He's never seen as, you know, what Jesus says. You will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One and coming on the clouds of heaven. It's never like Mr. Big Shot. But this passage in Daniel 7, alright. Daniel has his dream about the four beasts, and he's very confused, and it tells Daniel what's going to happen in the future. And it talks about what apparently is the Antichrist, or some sort of satanic final opposition to God. And it's eschatological in nature. Then I continued to watch because of the boastful words the horn was speaking. The horn was like the final kingdom of this earth. I kept looking until the beast was slain and its body destroyed and thrown into the blazing fire. The other beasts had been stripped of their authority, but were allowed to live for a period of time. Sorry, it's late. In my vision at night I looked, and there before me was one like a son of man, coming with the clouds of heaven. He approached the Ancient of Days and was led into his presence. He was given authority, glory, and sovereign power. All nations and peoples of every language worshipped him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion that will not pass away, and his kingdom is one that will never be destroyed. Now Daniel's confused about the dream, and so there's someone there in the vision, and he interprets it. Maybe an angel, somebody interprets the dream for Daniel. So the interpretation says this. So he gave me the interpretation of these things. The four great beasts are four kings that will rise from the earth, but the holy people of the Most High will receive the kingdom and will possess it forever and ever. Now you may argue right there that you know, the Son of Man is the servants of God. No. Keep going till we get to the final part. Alright, but the court will sit, and his power will be taken away and destroyed completely forever. Then the sovereignty, power, and greatness of all the kingdoms of earth will be handed over to the holy people of the Most High. His kingdom will be an everlasting kingdom, and all rulers will worship and obey him. Alright? So, there you go. It's clear who Jesus is claiming to be. He sits at the right hand of God. He approaches the Ancient of Days and is led in his presence. He's given authority, glory, and sovereign power. All nations and peoples of every language worship him. And then the interpretation says that they will worship the Most High, who will also have the everlasting kingdom. You know, if Jesus went around saying I was God, we might could interpret, you know, I'm God. We might say, well, he doesn't really mean God, you know. What do you mean by that, Jesus? But when you spell it out over the entire Jewish history with all sorts of recorded passages that from the past and everything you've said throughout your life, it makes it real clear. So that is one reason that the legendary hypothesis falls apart. So that being said, I hope this video makes a little bit of sense. Thank you for your time.